Oral history forms an integral part of any society. It enables people to share their stories in their own words as well as document their history. With this in mind, the Oral History Association of South Africa, that's correct, there is an Oral History Association of South Africa. They're holding the 19th Annual National Oral History Conference to look at lessons learned during the COVID-19 pandemic. For more on this, we're joined by the association's president, Professor Sekgothe Mokgoatsa. Thank you very much, sir, for availing yourself this morning. Prof, maybe let's just start with the work that you do. A brief introduction for our viewers.
Yeah, our organization is called OHASA in short. In full is the Oral History Association of South Africa. The association began as early as in 2003. What we have done is we established this organization because there is a shortage and a gap in the archives. In the archival space, the history of mostly marginalized communities is not recorded. When you go to the archives, you can only find high-profile stories. You can't find stories of commoners. And therefore, especially the majority of the black population, our histories are not recorded. Therefore, our role is to develop oral history in the country, to collect these stories, and also to promote them. And we want to popularize them. And our wish is to make sure that one day these stories are told in their own mother tongue and they are also published in their mother tongue. Because these stories are hidden from communities. And in the end, it sounds as if black people do not have a history of their own. And this debate has always been going on. You remember in historical debates in terms of whether Africans have a history, many people have always believed that because Africans do not write, therefore their history is not recorded anywhere, and therefore it means they do not have a history. The challenge here is what is writing. To write, as in the word graphos, graphic, means symbolic communication. Therefore, stories of African people are not necessarily, if they are not verbal, they are also graphically represented in mnemonic form, in symbolic form. And people, because they can't read the symbolic nature of these stories, they think African stories are not written down. Therefore, our role is to use the conventional method of writing and also video recording to capture the stories of people who are marginalized. Because for me, if you tell my story, you recognize who I am. If you tell your own story as well, you recognize yourself, because most of the stories we've told are for other communities and we never told stories about ourselves. And if we tell our stories about ourselves, we are affirming our identities. We are affirming who we are. And therefore, in the competition in the world of stories, because the stories that we tell are about our hopes, our dreams, and our fears. Therefore, if you want to understand the community, you need to understand the stories that they tell. In that manner, you'll understand their culture, their history, their heritage, their crafts, their arts, and wherever they intend to go in the future.
Sure. Prof, how is that collection process going, right? I ask maybe also in terms of how, or the kind of stories that you get. It's not just oral. Some of them are sung. I remember when I look at the moon during December, I remember my grandmother and the story she would tell about the moon. When you sing some of the riddles or whatever word we capture it as. I remember my grandfather would say "Mba mba mba kohaba inkomo," you know. So there was a story also to that. So how is that collection process going? What are the different kinds of ways of telling the story are you unearthing about a people?
There are different narratives that are told in various communities. We have got what we call the myths, which are stories that are connected with the supernatural, that tell about the creation of the universe. the creation of a human being and explain the beginning of life and the beginning of death and how death came unto us. And those narratives are there also. When you look at the Maruping narratives, you can see how the African story is told. When you go to the Freedom Park, you'll find how the African story of creation is told. And therefore, these stories, we have always known how the Hebrew traditions and all other stories that you find also in the Bible tell us about the beginning of life, the story of Adam and Eve. And that story is not the only story in the world. Every community has a story, and therefore we've got our stories. We also have stories that we call legends. These stories are stories about human beings who lived, like Chaka, like Mufulo, like the religious leaders that we have called the Nsitanas, the Hinzas of this world. But we also have the normal historical narratives of Manchi Masemula, of Khashane Mama Klepa, the historical narratives that are in every community that people have to start collecting, especially from family stories. Because if we don't do so, we risk being eclipsed, completely erased by other communities, and we end up telling other people's stories as if we do not have our own. Therefore, the challenge we have got now is people start to question some of the stories and say, but I have known this story this way. The issue here is the multiple versions of history do not necessarily mean the other story is wrong. Each story is an authentic story on its own, but what we need is at least have the story. Then you can compare it with others. Then you can see how you connect with the rest of the world. And when you collect your totems, then you see these people have a totem that is an elephant. Ask yourself, why do we share it? This guy is Zulu, I'm Mopedi, this one is Shona, but we have the common totem, which is the lion. Why? It means you have got a common origin somewhere. You might have dispersed, you might be having different stories that you tell now, but the original narrative means you come from the same root.
So, Prof, you identify the problem of historical memory fading, maybe also through, the elders in the family, because you still find, even now, young people who are questioning themselves, who am I, where do I come from, where you were originally maybe born in a city and you're wanting to trace your family. But then there's also this issue of language, right? So capturing the stories in our languages, which some researchers are estimating that they're going to be eroded over time. Not only are we losing the custodians or the elders that tell these stories and can pass them on, but we're also losing the language as well. How complicated does language make it?
The debate of language is very interesting, because many people believe Africans cannot produce their own stories. Africans cannot intellectually engage in their own languages. Therefore, debates continue in conferences only in English or in other foreign languages to the exclusion of African languages. And you are actually excluding the original ideas, because if you collect the stories in isiZulu and you tell them in English, the story becomes adulterated. The story becomes distorted, because there are certain elements of the story that are not translatable. That's where linguists speak about lost in translation. And once you do that, you are actually compromising the quality and the essence of the language. Therefore, it is very important that we collect the stories and tell them in the African languages. And we also analyze the stories in African languages, because as we do that, we do develop African languages as media of intellectual engagement. We do so also to recognize the worth of Africa, the richness of African languages. And if we ignore the use of African languages, we are in peril. I understand, though, that there are children who grow up in towns, but at least if they know the story and they're able to tell it in another language, that's also the versatility of language, that at least you know the story. At least you know that the story is your story of your own community or of a community X. Unlike where you just collect stories from one community in one language and all others are marginalized.
Prof, before we let you go, this is the 19th annual National Oral History Conference. How have you been able to measure your impact, right, in terms of your footprint, people knowing about the association, approaching the association, saying, well, you know, this is what I would like to contribute in terms of what I know, etc., etc. I guess maybe essentially the question, how have you been able to see whether South Africans are indeed connected to the work that you do?
Firstly, I want to recognize that we have made a major impact in academy, because since we started, people are starting to use oral history as a methodology in research, and others are using oral history as a discipline. They teach it as a complete discipline, and others are using oral history as a theory, and that for me, it's a major breakthrough in the academic world, where there is a lot of tension and where people do not resist new methodologies. And secondly, I've seen people teaching the sciences, accounting in oral history, using oral history as a method. And therefore, oral history has now become a force to reckon with in terms of influencing the teaching methods in other disciplines which are unlikely history. Thirdly, we have got chapters in the various provinces, and we see how the archives, all the provincial archives in the country, have adopted history, oral history as a major milestone, as a key performance area for all of them. And we will see that, I'm very proud to say it on air, that where we laid our seed in Mpumalanga, the intellectual engagement continues for more than 10 years now. And this is where we want to see. We are going for the second time in the Northern Cape. And we believe this second time around, we shall leave footprints wherein we're allowing the choir and the choir to be able to tell us their narratives in their own languages.
Mokgoatsa, let's let you go. We can see that there are people who want your attention, so thank you for sharing your time with us. Professor Sekgothe Mokgoatsa, he is with the Oral History Association of South Africa.